Night my brother came home from my parents' 35th anniversary. My mother spent 3 days cleaning a house that was already clean. She polished the good china twice. She bought new dish towels she'd never use again. She called me 4 times asking whether she should make his favorite pasta or whether he'd probably be eating fancy now. I told her to make the pasta. She made both. That was my brother for you. He had a way of making people want to be better than they were, cleaner, fancier, more prepared, without ever asking them to be. My husband noticed that before I did. We drove down from Columbus on a Friday afternoon in late October. The kind of day where the light goes gold and everything looks like something out of a painting you'd never actually hang in your house. My husband was quiet for most of the drive. That wasn't unusual. He's a quiet man by nature, deliberate, careful with words the way some people are careful with money. He works in financial compliance for a regional bank, which sounds boring until you understand what it actually means. What it means is that he has spent 11 years learning to notice when numbers don't line up, when stories have seams. He had his elbow on the window ledge and was watching the highway like it owed him something. I was going through my mental checklist. Wine. Flowers for my mom. The card I'd forgotten to sign and was planning to sign in the driveway. You looking forward to seeing your brother? He asked. Of course, I said. Aren't you? He made a sound that wasn't quite yes. I glanced over. What? Nothing. He shook his head slightly. Just tired from the week. I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I did. My brother had been living in Seattle for almost 9 years. He'd moved out there right after finishing what the family understood to be a graduate program in urban planning at the University of Washington. He'd gotten a job with a civil engineering consultancy, or that was how my father explained it at every holiday dinner, with the particular pride of a man who worked 30 years in a sheet metal plant and wanted something different for his kids. My brother owned a condo. He sent my parents a fruit basket every Christmas from a place that charged too much for pears. He flew home twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and he always looked good. Healthy, calm in a way I envied. I never thought to question any of it. That is the thing I have had to sit with since. Not the anger, not the sadness, the blindness. How completely I did not question any of it. My parents live in the same house we grew up in, a tan split level outside of Dayton, with a basketball hoop in the driveway that nobody had used in 15 years, and a garden my mother treated like a second child. The driveway was already full when we pulled in. My aunt's minivan, my uncle's truck, my cousin's car with a bumper sticker my mother pretended not to see. My brother's rental was parked at the curb. I felt the familiar pull when I saw it. That complicated mix of love and something slightly smaller, something that had no clean name. He was 4 years older than me. He'd always been the one who knew what he wanted. Or seemed to. Inside, the house smelled like garlic bread and candles and my mother's particular brand of anxiety, which expressed itself as excessive decorating. There were fall centerpieces on every flat surface. A banner above the kitchen doorway. Framed photos she'd clearly arranged specially for the occasion, including one of my brother and me at ages maybe 7 and 11, standing in front of a tent we put up in the backyard. My brother was standing by the kitchen counter with a glass of sparkling water talking to my uncle. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. A real smile, the kind that went all the way to his eyes, and crossed the room to hug me. You look great, he said. Mom made 2 dinners, I told him. He laughed. Of course she did. My husband shook his hand. They'd always been cordial, the two of them. Warm enough, but not close. My husband doesn't become close with people quickly. My brother I'd always thought was a little too easy to like, too smooth at the surface for my husband to fully trust. I'd written that off as personality difference. Reserved versus outgoing. I never considered there might be another reason. Dinner was everything my mother had planned for it to be. My father gave a toast that made my mom cry, which made the rest of us pretend not to be crying. My aunt told the story about their wedding that everyone knew by heart. My brother said something gracious and well timed about the kind of love that teaches you what love is supposed to look like. I watched my parents beam at him, and I felt, I'm being honest here, a small and familiar ache. Not jealousy exactly, more like being on the outside of a window looking at a light you can't quite reach. My husband sat beside me and ate his pasta and smiled at the right moments. Afterward, when the dishes were being cleared, I found him standing alone at the back window, looking out at the dark yard. You okay? I asked. Yeah. He didn't turn around right away. Do you know the name of the firm your brother works for? I blinked. Why? He turned then, and his expression was the one I recognized from our early years together. Careful, measuring, not yet ready to say the thing he was actually thinking. I just realized I've never actually looked them up. 11 years and I couldn't tell you a single name. It's some consultancy, I said. My dad always just calls it the firm. What's it called? I don't, I don't know the exact name. Why does it matter? He looked at me for a long moment. Probably doesn't, he said. Forget it. He went back to help carry dishes. I stood at the window for another minute looking at the yard. I didn't forget it. We stayed the night, as we always did. My parents' guest room had the same floral comforter it had since I was in high school and a nightstand lamp that flickered when you turned it on. I lay there listening to my husband breathe and trying to convince myself I wasn't thinking about what he'd said. It didn't work. The thing about growing up with someone is that you carry an image of them that predates their adult self by decades. When I thought of my brother, I still saw the 17-year-old who took apart a broken radio just to understand how it worked, who read every book in the public library science section before he'd read a single novel, who told my father at age 15 that he wanted to design the kind of infrastructure that didn't fail poor communities. My father had looked at him like he'd announced he was planning to walk on the moon. Then he'd started saving money. That memory sat in my chest all night. In the morning, I woke up early and went downstairs. My brother was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with coffee and his phone, wearing the same expression he'd worn the night before. Easy, comfortable, settled. He looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Morning, I said. Hey. He set his phone down. Mom's still asleep. Dad's in the garage. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. We talked about nothing important for a while. A show we'd both been watching, whether the drive down was bad. And then, without planning to, I heard myself ask, Are you happy out there? He looked up. In Seattle, I said. Like, genuinely, are you happy? Something moved across his face. Quick, like a cloud shadow over a field, then it was gone. Yeah, he said. It's a good life. What does that mean? He smiled. It means it's a good life, little sis. I let it go again. I was getting good at that. The drive home was quiet until we hit the interstate. I looked it up last night, my husband said. I knew immediately what he meant. And there's no engineering consultancy in Seattle registered under any name close to what your family uses. I searched every variation I could think of. I kept my eyes on the road. The sky was flat and gray, and the trees along the highway were losing their leaves in patches. Maybe it's under a parent company. Maybe it got renamed. Maybe. He didn't sound like he thought so. Or maybe you're wrong about the name. Your dad said it was something Meridian. I tried every combination. There's a Meridian architecture firm, a Meridian staffing, nothing in civil engineering. I didn't say anything. It could be nothing, he said. I'm not saying it's something. I'm just saying it's something. I'm just saying I couldn't find it. Then it's probably nothing. Probably. He watched the road. But your brother paid cash for a condo in Seattle, and 9 years ago, starting salaries in urban planning were not cash for a condo money, and I know because I financed 3 of those loans in my first 2 years at the bank. I felt something cold move through me. Not fear, exactly. More like the feeling when a room you've lived in all your life suddenly looks unfamiliar. Like all the furniture is the same, but nothing is quite where it was. There's an explanation, I said. There's probably an explanation, he agreed. I'd just like to know what it is. He said it gently. That was the thing about my husband. He doesn't deliver conclusions. He hands you the pieces and waits. He'd learned, in 11 years of watching what happens when numbers don't line up, that the worst thing you can do is tell someone what they're looking at before they can see it for themselves. I've thought about that for the rest of the drive home. I called my brother 3 days later. I drafted what I was going to say probably 15 times in my head, and then I threw all of it out and just said his name when he picked up and let the silence sit there between us. Hey, he said, and I could hear it, just barely, just a half second of something, before his voice went normal again. I need to ask you something, I said. Okay, what's the name of the firm? Your firm, the one you've been at since you got to Seattle. A pause. Longer than it should have been. Why? Because I've been your sister for 30 years and I don't know the name of where you work. Another pause. The longest one yet. When he spoke, his voice was different. Something had gone out of it. How long have you known? And that was when I knew. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor, but that's where I ended up. And I pressed my hand flat against the tile and breathed. I don't know anything, I said. Tell me. It came out in pieces over the next hour. That's the only way I can describe it. Not like a dam breaking, but like a wall with small cracks, one appearing and then another, water finding every seam. He had enrolled in the graduate program. That part was true. He'd moved to Seattle, found an apartment, started the first semester, and then, somewhere in the middle of a particularly brutal winter, a program that was harder than he'd expected, a sense of failure he didn't know how to name. He had stopped going. Not dropped out, exactly. Just stopped. And then it was too late to explain stopping. And then he panicked and made something up, and the lie was small at first. Just, I'm taking a leave of absence. And then it kept growing because that is what lies do when you tend them long enough. He'd found work. Real work. He'd spent a few years in property management, then moved into general contracting, then started his own small renovation company that had, by every measure he understood, become legitimately successful. He owned a condo because he'd saved carefully for years. He sent the fruit baskets because he felt he had to, some way of sending money home by another name. He had never asked our parents for money after the first year. He had never taken $1 of support. He had just kept the story alive because he was terrified of what would happen if it died. What were you afraid of? I asked, specifically. He was quiet for a moment, that Dad would look at me differently. I thought about my father, who had worked his entire adult life in a plant making sheet metal parts for appliances, who had told his son at 17 that he had what it took to change things, who had said at every holiday dinner for 9 years. With the same expression, my son, the engineer, I thought about what it cost to be inside that sentence, what it cost to be afraid of losing it. He works with his hands, I said, Dad. I know. You thought he'd be ashamed of you for working with yours. Silence. Yeah, my brother said finally. I thought he'd be ashamed. I stayed on the kitchen floor for a long time after we hung up. I didn't tell my husband that night. I know that might seem strange, given that he was the one who'd opened the door. But I needed to hold it by myself for a little while, to understand the shape of it before I handed it to anyone else. What I kept coming back to was not the deception. I know that's the part that sounds loudest. 9 years, a false career, an elaborate maintenance of a story that was never true, and I won't pretend that didn't matter. It did. It still does. But what I kept thinking about was my brother, at 23, in a city he barely knew, in a program he was drowning in, trying to figure out how to tell our father that the plan had changed, and not being able to, and deciding, instead, to disappear into a version of himself that the people he loved would still recognize. I know something about the distance between who you are and who the people you love think you are. I know something about how that distance can feel, at first, like protection, and how over time it starts to feel like a prison, and how the longer you live inside it, the more certain you become that there is no way out that doesn't cost you everything. He had built a real life. That was the truth underneath the lie. He had become someone, not the someone anyone had planned for him, but someone. A man who ran his own company, who paid his own bills, who had built things with his hands and could point to them in the world. He had done the thing my father had wanted him to do. He had made something of himself, and he had been so afraid his father wouldn't be able to see it that he had hidden it for 9 years. I told my husband that weekend. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He built a business, he said. He did, a real one. Yes, my husband thought about this. That took more than a degree would have. My brother came to Dayton in December. He drove this time, which took him 2 days, and I didn't understand why until he told me he needed the time. He pulled into my parents' driveway on a Thursday evening and sat in the car for almost 20 minutes before he came inside. I know because I was watching from the guest room window. My parents knew before he walked through the door. I had called them the week before, separately, my mother first, then my father, and I had done what my husband always did. I handed them the pieces. I let them come to it themselves. My mother had cried. My father had gone very quiet. When I called back the next day, he said, "What does he do?" Actually, what does he build? I told him. Kitchen renovations, primarily, some commercial work, a historic preservation project outside Tacoma that a local paper had run a small piece on. My father listened to all of it. "He's good at it," he asked. "He's very good at it." Another silence. "Okay," my father said. That was all. But I knew what it meant. I didn't stay for the conversation. That was theirs to have, not mine. I made sure there was food. I made sure my mother had tissues without making it obvious, and then I went and sat in the car with my husband for 2 hours and tried to read a book and failed completely. My husband didn't try to fill the silence. He just sat there with me in the way he's always been good at present, close, unhurried. After a while, he said, "He's going to be okay." "I know," I said. "Your dad too. I know that too. You did the right thing." I thought about that. I don't know if I did the right thing or the only thing I could do after I knew. Sometimes those are the same. The porch light came on. My mother appeared in the front door and looked toward the car, and even from that distance I could see that she'd been crying and that she was also smiling, which is a combination I associate entirely with her. She waved at us to come in. My brother was at the kitchen table. My father was beside him. They weren't touching. That's not how the men in our family sit, but they were close. And my father's hand was resting near my brother's arm, not quite on it, in the way of a man who wants to reach out and is still finding his way back to knowing that he can. My brother looked up when I walked in. He looked exhausted and hollowed out, and underneath all of that, lighter than I had seen him look in years. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said back. That was enough. There is a version of the story where the ending is clean, where everything is forgiven in a single conversation, and the family sits down together, and someone says something that resolves every wound. That version is easier to tell. It's more satisfying to hear. It moves in a straight line from problem to solution and leaves you with the sense that love is always enough if you just apply it correctly. That's not the version I have. What I have is messier and slower and more true. A brother who still has hard phone calls with our father sometimes, when old assumptions surface and have to be looked at directly. A father who is proud, genuinely and fully proud, but who sometimes falls quiet when the subject of the engineering program comes up. Not with anger, I think, but with something more private. A question about what he had expected and what expecting it had cost his son. A mother who says, Now, when anyone asks about my brother, he builds beautiful things. She says it without hesitation. I have heard her say it to a woman at church, to her book club, to my aunt, who still occasionally brings up the master's program as if no one has corrected the record. He builds beautiful things. She says it like it was always the sentence, like she never needed a different one. And my husband, who handed me a thread and waited, and who has never once said I knew something was off, in a way that sounded like credit, who understood that seeing something clearly is only useful when you know what to do with what you've seen. There is something I think about sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, about all the years my brother spent maintaining a version of himself that he thought was the only one our family could love, about how long he carried that, about what it takes to keep a story straight when you are living on the wrong side of it. And I think about how he finally came home, not to the story, just home. I don't know what he would have done if we had reacted differently. I don't know what would have happened if my father had been a different man, or my mother, or if love in our family had turned out to have conditions that none of us had previously discovered. I am grateful I don't have to know. What I know is what I saw, my father's hand not quite touching my brother's arm, and both of them staying at that table until the food went cold, talking about something no one else needed to hear. That is the version I have. It is imperfect and ongoing and entirely ours. I'll take it.